Hey everybody, I hope you're staying safe. You've probably heard some conversation recently about something called qualified immunity, and you've probably heard a lot of people calling for qualified immunity to be ended. In fact, Libertarian Congressman Justin Amash has introduced a bill that would end qualified immunity. But what is qualified immunity, and why do so many people want to get rid of it? Well, simply put, qualified immunity is an absolutely ridiculous legal doctrine that effectively makes it impossible to sue police officers, politicians, and other government officials if they're abusive. See, before the 1960s, if any officer abused you or in any other way violated your rights, you could sue them, not just the department, but the individual officer. This helped to keep them in check. And now that we can all carry around high definition cameras, if we still had this ability to sue them if they violated our rights, it would stop them in their tracks. But starting in the 1960s, mostly to allow officers to abuse civil rights protesters, the court started imposing an absurd doctrine of qualified immunity that basically says that officers can't be sued for abuses as long as their actions were reasonable. And who decides whether or not the action is reasonable? Why, the officer who's being accused, of course. Imagine being on trial for a crime and being able to show up and just say, well, Your Honor, I thought what I did was perfectly reasonable, and the judge throws the case out. That's how qualified immunity works. And in 2001, the Supreme Court somehow made it even worse. They said that even if the officer's actions weren't deemed reasonable, that they still couldn't be sued unless there was already a precedent of that exact same abuse happening in that exact same jurisdiction, which had already been ruled as abusive. So for example, in Tennessee, police were allowed to have their canine officer ruthlessly bite a suspect who was already handcuffed, even though a similar case had already been ruled abusive, because in the first case, the suspect was lying on his side instead of sitting up. And in another case, prison guards were allowed to pepper spray a prisoner in his cell for no reason, even though a similar case had been ruled abusive, because in the first case, the guards used a taser instead of pepper spray. This is why the police are brutalizing you with no fear of repercussion. This is why they're bashing people's heads in and spraying tear gas on them. This is why they broke into Breonna Taylor's home in plain clothes and murdered her. This is why they opened fire on Duncan Lemp's home while he slept and murdered him. This is why they slowly choked George Floyd to death while a crowd watched and begged them to stop. Qualified immunity is the doctrine that has allowed police officer after police officer to get off unscathed murder after murder, abuse after abuse of innocent people in this country. Here are some upcoming cases that are expected to be thrown out because of qualified immunity. A case where officers stole $225,000. A police officer who shot a 10-year-old while trying to shoot a non-threatening family dog. Prison officials who locked an inmate in a sewage-flooded cell for days, SWAT team members who fired gas grenades into an innocent woman's empty home, medical board officials who rifled through a doctor's client files without a warrant, county officials who held a 14-year-old in solitary confinement with no trial for over a month, a cop who body slammed a 5-foot-tall woman for walking away from him, police who picked up a mentally infirmed man, drove him to the county line and dropped him off at dusk along the highway where he was later struck and killed. Qualified immunity is what allowed Derek Chauvin to continue serving after at least 17 excessive force complaints prior to his murdering George Floyd. Qualified immunity is also why non-abusive cops stand back and allow abusive cops to do what they do. Imagine if those officers could be sued for refusing to arrest a fellow officer who was breaking the law. How much more proactive do you think they'd be if they could lose everything? If they didn't. Qualified immunity needs to end, and Joe Jorgensen and I will do that. We'll also end civil asset forfeiture. I'll be making a video soon explaining what that is. We will end the militarization of our police, and we will maximize the civil liberties protections that are often denied to us, especially the most marginalized among us. If you'd like to help spread the message about why we need to end qualified immunity and Joe and my plan to do that, be sure to share this video. Thanks, and stay safe out there.